Welcome, everyone. Apologies, we're running a tiny bit late. Had some small technical difficulties just trying to get headphones to work, but we're good to go now. Thank you so much, Yana, for joining us today. Before we get started, just very quickly, as usual, we are recording this webinar, so if you have to drop off, don't worry about it. You will be receiving an email from the product team over the next few days with the link to our YouTube channel. And we are going to take questions at the end of this webinar. So if you have them, just drop them on the Q&A box, and we'll be answering questions at the end. With that said, Yana, again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Andrea. Hi, everybody. So my name is Yana Yushkina, and I am so pleased to be here to speak with you all about data-driven product design and development. So a little bit about me. I'm currently the product lead for Search in Chrome, and I work with 24 or so folks on the product management ladder with UX designers and researchers, and of course, software engineers to make Chrome the best place on the internet to find information. I also partner cross-functionally a lot with cross-work with Search, Ads, Google Lens, and other folks at Google. Before this role, I was the product manager for stability, for translated language, and for customization efforts, also all in Chrome. And before I was a product manager, I was a data analyst. And so because of that, I believe I bring a unique view on how to use data to be a better product manager and to influence people. So without further ado, let's get to it. So what is data-driven product design, which is a term that is used a lot? Really, it's all about an approach to building products based on quantitative measures and a scientific method. So what we do is we formulate hypotheses about how we can solve user needs. Then we test those hypotheses, and then we validate, reject, or iterate on those hypotheses based on the results. And so how do we begin to formulate a hypothesis? We start with, we could start with actually many different places. We can start with insights that we drew from user research. We can start with product intuition that we've developed over the years about the product that we've been working on. We can start with existing analytics on user behavior if our product is already out in the wild. And oftentimes, actually, it's some combination of those. And so based on that information, we develop an insight into a particular user problem and how to solve it. And we formulate a guess as to what we might change or what product we might develop to solve that user need. And then we bet that it's going to influence some particular metric or set of metrics in a certain direction. So a quick note on metrics. It can be hard to agree on what metric should move in a particular experiment or for a particular product overall. And so it can be helpful to designate buckets of metrics that you care about. The primary metric that we tend to focus on is the Northstar metric, aptly named because it's what you follow, and that is really closely tied to your overall product goals. For example, you might want to, you might be growing, and so what you really care about are your one-day actives or activations. Or maybe you really care about engagement, and so you care more about, let's say, your 1 day over 7 day, or you care about time spent in a particular application. So that Northstar metric ideally is just the one, or at the very least, it's a couple of metrics that are complementary, so they don't move in different directions. And it's typically quite hard to move in a given experiment or with a small change. In addition to that, we tend to develop a set of metrics that complement that Northstar metric and that might be proxies for it, or that might be easier to move, but are highly correlated with our Northstar. And the reason why we want that set of experiments is because we want to know that our experiments are actually doing what we want them to. And as I mentioned previously, the Northstar typically won't move during those. And then last but not least, we also typically will have guardrail metrics. And guardrail metrics, again, are aptly named, and they're there to make sure that in your pursuit of that growth or that engagement, you don't hurt the overall health of your product, or if you're part of a product that's part of a larger ecosystem, that you don't hurt other metrics that matter to the company. Something that's quite important with this approach is to actually write down your hypothesis as well as the full set of metrics that you want to move and the direction in which you expect them to move. So the way that we do this typically is that we actually write up a very detailed analysis doc before we run our A/B tests. And the reason for that is largely once you've done all that work and once you are ready to launch a feature or a product, the pressure to go forward with the launch is very high, both external and internal. And so you really want to make sure that you're making those decisions in a principled way. And the way to do that is to actually write down the set of criteria that will allow you to go forward in the future. This is also something that can be helpful when discussing with your team, whether to launch or iterate or reject whatever change you are going to make. And it can be helpful as well when going to leadership and convincing them whatever you're doing is a good idea. So that you have a scientific method and something that is hard to argue with to make that decision. So when it comes to testing your hypothesis, what do you need? Basically a bunch of tools that ideally are in place already and that you just need to tap into. So quite obviously you need A/B testing tools to set up your experiment. So for larger companies, for example, for myself, this is infrastructure that, there's a team that develops. And so all you really need to do is how to use it. You don't actually have to think about it. Some of the characteristics of a testing system that is good is that it randomly assigns users to your control and experiment, or in other words, kind of your null hypothesis and your treatment groups in an unbiased way, so that the population of your users does not skew one way or the other. Sometimes there are also ways for you to check that, because even a random assignment system might still generate bias in your experiment and control groups. Something that you can do to avoid that is run what is called pre-periods. So actually look at data that you care about, look at the metrics that you care about for your two groups without any kinds of treatment applied to them, and make sure that you can correct for those differences if you note any, or select other groups. And then another thing that's quite important if you run a lot of experiments at the same time is avoid crosstalk between experiments. So crosstalk is when the two experiments are affecting each other's populations in an unexpected way. So that's, again, something that ideally is something that your testing system already accounts for. And if it does not, you need to manually think about this and understand what other experiments are running and how they might affect your results. So the next step here that, again, hopefully is something that's already taken care of, is that once you're actually running your experiments, you need to track how they affect the metrics that you care about, which means that user actions and other metrics, for example, performance metrics, need to be logged. And there's some things that, again, here to think about and to understand about your system. Is there downsampling, meaning does your sample at some point get reduced to a representative population, in which case is that done in an unbiased way? For most smaller products or newer companies, that probably is not happening and not a problem. I work on Chrome. We have billions of users that do multiple billions of actions a day, so we downsample. And then lastly, you need analysis tools to understand the impact of your experiments. So what does it mean to understand the impact of your experiments? generally what we look for is statistical and practical significance in your results. So since we're testing whether there's an effect of your change, we have a null hypothesis, which, in layway terms just means that whatever we currently have is our null hypothesis, whatever most of our users are seeing. And we're trying to see if our change is going to affect the metrics that we care about. So we try to figure out if there's a real difference and what its magnitude is. And to do that, we use statistical tests. Typically at the 95% significance level, which corresponds to a p-value of 5%. If you don't know these terms, that's okay. You don't need to be a statistics major to understand these things, or to at the very least to understand why they matter. But just kind of, if there's one thing that you walk away with, is that what we're trying to assess is that the result that we're seeing is not purely attributable to chance. And then what we also care about is not just statistical significance, but if there is a real practical impact, right? Because if you have a large enough sample, even the smallest differences can be statistically significant. And for that, we look at the confidence interval, which will show us the upper and lower bounds for the effect size. And that's where we can actually see what the mean difference based on those is that we can expect on the metrics that we care about. So the last bit in this development cycle is to actually act on the results of your A/B tests. And this is where one of my favorite quotes comes in. If we have data, let's look at data. If all we have are opinions, let's go with mine. The former CEO of Netscape, I believe, said this. And the idea here is that the reason why we write down our hypotheses and the reason why we conduct A/B tests is because it's a lot easier to make decisions based on an objective result rather than opinions, because if we go with opinions, your boss is always going to get their way. So when you have discussions around which features to launch or how to prioritize future work, you can actually use prior experiments to do that. So that concludes the formal part of my presentation, and I'd love to take questions now. I'm going to stop presenting.
I'm here. Excellent. So we do have a few questions. The first is, can you give an example of crosstalk?
Absolutely. So crosstalk is, as I mentioned, is this idea that when you're running multiple experiments that are affecting the same population of users, that they can interact in unexpected ways. So the way that you would normally experience that is that your results will look unexpected, and oftentimes unexpectedly good. So imagine that you're running, you're running your test and everything is kind of looking neutral. And then all of a sudden on December 4th, totally not picking that because that didn't happen to me. On December 4th, suddenly your metrics start to blow up, right? You start to see the metric that you care about go up. And what you shouldn't do in that situation is get really happy and decide, yay, I'm getting what I want, let's launch this. You should ask, was there another experiment that started that day? And in fact, in this totally hypothetical, not real situation, there was another experiment that got started that day. And there was crosstalk between the two experiments. And so that effect was not real. So the main things, again, there are be skeptical about your results and understand if there are multiple experiments running that affect the exact same population. Because if there are, they might create effects that are not there, or hide effects that are there.
Excellent. The next question has been asked twice, so I'm going to go ahead and go on to this one, which is, what sample size would you say is the minimum needed to get significance when it comes to A/B testing?
And unfortunately, the answer I'm going to give is not a fun one, which is it depends.
I love that answer.
Yeah, and there's something called a power analysis that I have completely forgotten how to do, but a power analysis is exactly that. It calculates what is the minimum sample that you need to actually detect a difference of a particular size. So if that's something that, if you're dealing with really small samples, and let's say you're actually trying to get enough users into your sample in order to test a change, that's something that you would need to do, hopefully with the help of a data analyst and somebody who knows what they're doing.
Excellent. We have a lot of questions. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to try to get through these because there's so many and they're all so good. How do you go about defining a set of metrics that can be affected by experiments and will move the Northstar metric? To be clear, the question is about how you avoid gut feel when determining your leading metrics.
Absolutely. And I didn't stress this enough in the presentation. Gut feel is not a bad thing, right? Like when we formulate hypotheses, it is a combination of what we have observed in the past. And when we, in many ways, right, that starts to deposit ourselves in our subconsciousness. And we kind of like know what changes will affect a certain thing. As far as how to identify those specific metrics, the Northstar is really easy because it's literally like, what is your goal, and translate that to a measurable outcome, right? Another term for this is OKRs, objectives and key results. Our objective is what we're trying to achieve. Our key result is how we measure it. So it typically is obviously like, I want to increase my revenue. How much money are we making, right? Like it's really, really clear. The problem then is small changes won't move it in a statistically significant way, even with a lot of data. So what are things that are related to it? So you can look at correlations, right? So for example, maybe revenue in your case is strongly, preceded by engagement. So we know that like users who are engaged are going to purchase more of whatever. So you can look at those engagement metrics, right? Like clicks or how much time a user is spending. So aside from correlation analysis, I'm trying to think of other techniques that we have used in the past. You can also you can do statistical regression analysis. So you can see kind of if a certain variable moves, how does it affect the thing that you really care about? So it gets kind of progressively more technical. But typically I start with just correlations, which are pretty easy to see. Like, does this thing go up when this thing goes up? Great, let's make sure that we look at the thing that goes up before the thing that we really care about increases. Hopefully
that's a simple explanation and it makes sense. Speaking of Northstar metrics, how can you be sure that you have chosen the right one?
It's a great question. So as I mentioned, like it's quite clear what your goal is pretty clear, right? So the specific thing that you're trying to move is typically easy to identify. What's hard to identify is it ever going to be predictable? Is it ever going to move even with a large change in a predictable way? So sometimes you do that through experience, right? You run a whole bunch of experiments that theoretically move you towards your goal. And then you notice that actually none of them have moved the metric that you've identified as your North Star. And that's when you need to go and try to identify a new one. And that, like, for example, that has happened to my larger team, where we had one North Star for a year and realized like it wasn't right. Another thing that's actually kind of important is, can I explain it to my team and can I explain it to my stakeholders? So is the metric something that translates into English language? Sometimes we get really, really nuanced, like, oh, it's engagement minus this plus this, like times 2, and we don't want that because that's really, really hard to explain and it's not intuitive. The other, I think, related thing is you want your entire team to be very much like united around the fact that that's the goal and that's the metric that you're trying to move, and both its translatability into English language and like just generally is your team aligned is important. So that's another way that your North Star could be wrong. Like you don't kind of set it in isolation outside of your team.
That's a really good answer and a very good question about North Star metrics. Thank you, John, for asking that. Our next question is, how do you decide for which features you actually run A/B tests for?
That's great. Great question. I would say, if it were up to me, I would say all of the significant changes that affect user behavior and or that would affect performance in a way that you want to track. So at least for my team, we run experiments for pretty much everything. We are a little bit unique in that way.
I love that, by the way. And I got a message from my product manager saying that is the dream.
And I don't know if it's biased because I come from that background, and so I just brought that approach with us, or if it's the particular area that we work on. We work on search and Chrome, which is quite important to the bottom line of the company that I work for. And so we have to actually know exactly what the impact of a change is, and it can be unpredictable, right? And so you want to understand that, even if the change is neutral. I would generally say like bias towards experimentation, because it helps you have conversations about what you're doing that are based on fact and not on, hey, my opinion is better than yours and I can scream louder, right? So,
of course. On that, can you recommend either any A/B testing tools or experimentation frameworks?
That was a question that I was afraid of. So I come from a big company where all of this is built out for me. So I'm not an expert on that. There are tools like Optimizely that I think are pretty familiar to most folks who are working in companies that don't have that. But generally, I am unfortunately not helpful here because I don't have firsthand experience with them.
To answer that question, I have, or at ProdPet, we use Teresa Torres's opportunity solution tree. So Robert, who asked this question, I can recommend that one in terms of experimentation, because it's, as you were saying, it's not about having the loudest person in the room saying my idea is the best one, but actually analyzing all of the ideas and giving all of those ideas equal time and opportunity. So Robert, I can recommend that one if that helps. Next question here is, can you give an example of guardrails in correlation with other metrics as well as Northstar metric?
Absolutely. So one thing to note is guardrails are often uncorrelated with the metrics you're trying to move. So they either don't move in the same direction or they can even move in the opposite direction. A good one is engagement. It could be your Northstar metric, and your guardrail might be latency, right? So whenever you add more features that might make your users more engaged, your latency might increase. And you don't want to do that, right? And so those are the kinds of things that you might want to track as you add changes to your code. Besides performance metrics, for a product like Chrome, you can imagine that there are lots of trade-offs, and different teams need to understand how their changes are affecting like another team's Northstar metric. So those, again, might be completely uncorrelated or might move in different directions.
Cool. Let me grab another one from here. We already did the tools one. If we don't have an infrastructure already in place, how do you suggest we get started?
And I would suggest you get started by looking at the market of what tools exist and which ones are right for you. I imagine that there are like all sorts of different price points. If you're a company that does actually gather a lot of data, but you don't have the tools built out, I highly suggest that your next hire is somebody who is a data engineer. I think this is something that still is not seen as a necessity. And unless, like, again, you have somebody on your team, on your product or development team that just happens to have data experience, those are things that amazingly often just don't get implemented. And so you continue to have these discussions around what to launch that are not driven by fact.
Yeah, there's quite a few questions here around how to get started at low cost if you don't have the tools.
Sounds like I should actually just go do some homework on that.
But Typeform is also a really good way of just, asking questions and running experiments. We use Typeform quite a bit over here, and it doesn't really cost, it's not like super, super expensive. But definitely, I would agree that having a data person is invaluable. Absolutely. Next question, can this approach apply to hardware or is it just software?
That's a fantastic question. Obviously, with software, making changes is less costly. they're less, they can be more independent, right? Like I can make a change that's completely not tied to the rest of whatever I'm building. So it's a little harder, it's a lot harder to do with hardware. You can still do this with test devices. So you won't have a huge sample of things, but you could still make two things that's an A and a B, right? And see how they perform and measure what the metrics that you care about are. Like if you're building cameras, right? Like what is the performance of that? But it won't be the same approach. This largely is targeted software.
The next question I find really interesting because it's generally the sort of friction point where people go, oh, well, that's why we don't experiment, which is, do you find that there's extra or additional effort on the development team to develop two versions of something when you're experimenting, or do you only apply this to smaller features?
Yeah, there is, and not just that. So two things. One, oftentimes when you're building kind of a new functionality, right, you're not building two things, you're building the one thing and you're just testing whether you're going to launch it or not, whether it's actually good or not for your users or for your goals. So it's not that you're building twice. But it could still be wasted effort if you built out that thing and then your experiments show that, hey, it's not moving metrics in the right direction, or actually it's like dropping metrics, etc. But I think that is something that you almost like, it needs to be a cultural paradigm shift, and one that I have gone through with some of my teams where you almost change your mind from like, hey, it's only worth building if it's launching, to like, this is a hypothesis, and the work we're doing is to test that hypothesis, and we never want to launch something that doesn't meet our bar, right, and doesn't meet our goals. The second thing is there is huge overhead to actually running experiments, particularly, again, if you're running a lot of them, there's overhead to analyzing them. As a product person, you can fill in those gaps, right, if you get familiar with your code base. Back in the day, I would even write like configurations because they tend to be like really, I think at the time they were like simple JSONs. Like I would do that, which is, not normal, but you can help your team if you are really, really strapped. But it is an overhead. It is worth it.
I would agree with that. And also, again, you don't have to go full on developer mode. There are things that you can do for those of us like myself. I'm not the best at coding either. I was a jQuery queen back in the day, but that's died. Again, things like Typeform, just quick prototypes, those are also experiments. So when it comes to experimentation, I find that the friction point is always, oh, but my developers can't spend time on that. And it's like, well, you don't always necessarily have to go all out. Next question here. When you don't have a large population to test with, how do you create meaningful quantitative experiments, or should you concentrate on qualitative research?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. One is it particularly matters to have a larger population size when you're testing a whole bunch of things. So if you're only performing the test on like one key variable, you need a smaller population to get that same power. The second thing is, you can get meaningful results from like a couple hundred samples, and a couple hundred users sounds like a lot, but if you're actually looking at just like actions that they're performing, it's time, right? So you just need to run your experiment for longer. So there are ways to get around the fact that, hey, my product doesn't have enough users. No problem. Just look at them for a longer period of time. And I would say too, like I talked about statistical significance. Yes, that is the right way to do things. However, you can also you can use your judgment if you're looking at a very, very long period of time to see how things are performing.
Excellent. On the same vein of quantitative and qualitative, how do you utilize both to help validate results or insights that you're seeing?
That's a wonderful question. So quantitative analyses can tell us what, they can't tell us why. And so a lot of the qualitative studies help us understand why. Before we start development, if we can, it's really helpful to do UX research either to understand foundational needs, or if we have an idea, to get a gauge on, hey, does this make sense? Why does it make sense? Why does it not? What part of this is confusing? So that you can actually change what you're going to do. And then afterwards, it can be helpful to ask users in context, right? Because like looking at something that's a prototype or even, or a mock can get you one set of answers. And then after you've developed it, it could get you a different set of answers. So let's say you run an experiment and you either get unexpected results or dampened results, or you get great results and you just want to understand how to proceed and improve your feature. It can be helpful to ask questions around that in context. And that's something that, again, like you can actually build into your tool, where you have on in your application or whatever your product is, questions that you ask your users. Like, and I would just keep those to like max 2. So nobody likes to answer too many survey questions, and be really thoughtful. Yeah, about how you construct those. So no leading questions, right? Like, when what I mean by that is, don't construct the question in such a way that it actually leads your users to answer in a way that you want them to. And kind of really, really focusing on what you're trying to understand. For example, we're going to be launching a feature really soon, and I really want to understand if users feel like we're respecting their privacy when we are showing them something that is based on their history, and that they understand their controls, right? So that's something where we're going to run a survey in product to understand if that's true, and if it's not true, why it's not true, so we can make changes.
Yeah, that's, I don't know how other product managers feel, but leading questions is still something I struggle with sometimes. Absolutely. I love this next question. How do we influence the company or the company culture to be more experiment driven?
Man,
that's a tough
talk
one,
to
isn't
them
it?
about, yeah, talk to them about data-driven design. Well, on the one hand, right, like the zeitgeist is with you. A focus on data-driven practices is very, very popular right now. So there are lots of resources you can share, including articles, and feel free to share this presentation. There are many other videos that talk about this. So basically being like, hey, like we don't want to be the ones who are doing this, in a way that's not the kind of front of the market. Similarly to, like, you can actually tell people the story of why this will make their lives better, right? So in many ways, saying, hey, we're going to have fewer stupid arguments. We're going to have fewer discussions where we're literally repeating the same ideas over and over in the same room. I'm sure we've all been in those conversations where you're like, yep, we've talked about this before. And then having a way to actually break that tie is going to be useful. I think the other thing is actually, we talked about how it's a tax to run this experiment, and it's a tax to, especially if you're building multiple versions on developers. But it also means that you don't spend a year building the wrong thing. You don't spend multiple years building the wrong thing. And that's actually like the biggest reason that I didn't mention for why we do this, right? Like, we want to get signals early that we are on the right path. And so I think that can be a really, really strong reason to change culture. That, hey, it's going to save people time, and it's going to save the company money, and it's going to save everyone frustration.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. I think avoiding the risk of business failure and accidentally adding up to useless tech debt. I mean, tech debt is something you're always going to have, but building the wrong thing, as you said, is a great way of proposing that. Cool. I hope you still have time for a few more questions here. Let's pick this one. I like it. Are you only testing high fidelity functional prototypes, or are you also running experiments on lower wireframe stages?
That's a great question. So I mentioned kind of qual and quant approaches to this. When I'm talking about like quantitative approaches, we're testing things live, right? Like, we are actually testing things if you use Chrome, on the stable channel. Like, you right now are probably in many experiments if you're a Chrome user. if we want to get a gauge on whether our direction is right, or actually back to that whole like many versions, if we're not sure which way to go, that's a great time to do things with a mock, or like something that lots of people use is, I think it's Keynote on Mac. Literally, it's just mocks, but you click through them. Like you could make that, or you and your designer could make that together, where it feels like it's a real thing, but it's not. And you can get get enough users to test it out. It's not going to give you enough power to really say with any degree of certainty whether you should launch something or not, but it can direct you in the right direction.
Here's another great question, which is about prioritization. Usually there are more hypotheses than development capacity to build and run tests. What method do you use to prioritize?
It's a great question. And in many ways, right, like this is your job as a product manager. Like this is the job as prioritization. And you, like typically, if we have multiple ideas, right, multiple things that we want to build, and we use different frameworks to prioritize them. How close are they aligned to our goals? Let's say these are actually ideas that are all, aligned to the same goal that is our P0. And then as far as like, what is the strength of our conviction? It's a combination of what do we know to be true and what do we think might be true and what is our gut telling us, and what have we tried in the past that's worked in this direction. So I wish I could tell you that it's like, hey, here are five easy steps to figure out how to prioritize something, but it's both an art and a science.
Absolutely. The best I can say to that, if I can contribute anything, is we do offer a roadmap clinic if anyone wants to join. We have some really smart people that might be able to give you some guidance on that. But there's a really great question that just came through, which is everything you're sharing makes complete sense and is obviously really valuable, but do you feel it's something that only large companies can do? And if not, what advice can you give to a smaller team that is just getting started with this way of working?
No, that's a great question. And to be honest, as I was preparing this presentation, that was my greatest fear, that my advice wasn't going to be as valuable to companies that don't necessarily have these data infrastructures. So I would say, like, do the best that you can to still gather quantitative information. Literally, like, you could, let's say you are a SaaS company, you could gather the data yourself in a spreadsheet and analyze it, right? Like you could still look for correlations. You could still look at, hey, like we did this pricing structure for this team, we did this pricing structure, or sorry, this set of customers, this pricing structure for this set of customers. What does it look like our outcomes were? Maybe you're not, it's not going to have the same sort of it's not going to be correct, but it can still help you to use the information that you have. I would just say, like, whatever you do, avoid being stuck in a place for a long time where you're not using information about your users or customers and their behavior. And it also sounds like Andrea was saying that there are some cheap tools that that you can avail yourself of, even at earlier stages as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're not even 1% of the size of Google, but we are very, very experiment driven here at ProdPad. And there's definitely things that we use. There's frameworks that you can look into, like the opportunity solution tree. So there's definitely things that you can do. And I would agree with what Yana said earlier, is if you can, invest in a data person, because it's absolutely going to be invaluable for your team. Yana, do you have time for more questions?
I do. I have 16 more minutes.
16 more minutes. Excellent. We've got quite a few, so we're going to try to get through, I guess, the ones that we can. How do you get feedback on a prototype without raising the expectations of the users? Ooh, good question.
It is a really good question. And actually, like, again, we are so bold or stupid as to actually like raise users' expectations by experimenting with real things that some users get and that get written up in the media that we don't launch, right? So I think the thing here is to, one, understand your users. We are a free product, so I think it's pretty okay that, like, we don't launch everything that you might expect us to launch, although there could still be a media hit, right? If you are a SaaS company and you promised your client that you were going to build something for them, and then you don't, right? That the experience might be quite different. I think one of the things to do there is to actually be very open, have a group of beta testers, right? Have a group of users that are really, really like the most tech savvy, most excited about you, and show them your early features and communicate to them that like, hey, this is experimental and we're just trying to understand things, and you're our most like special beloved users. Tell us what you think, right? Or experiment with this, play with this, and like this might not make it, but it would be because it wasn't good enough. So that's another way to do that. Again, like Chrome has a beta version specifically for that, and there might be ways for you to do something like that either formally or by creating a group of users that you've identified as particularly passionate about your product.
A really great question just came in is, do you have any recommended reading for the things that you've talked about today? Any books, perhaps?
Oh man, my econometrics textbooks. That's a great question. I'll follow up with you afterwards and just have that be a share out later.
Excellent. Great question, by the way. I believe it was Jason that asked that. From your experience, when is the best time to include design in talks about selecting metrics and running tests?
That's a fantastic question. And it does depend on kind of how your teams are structured. I would say more generally, when you're constructing that hypothesis document with what metrics are going to move and in which direction is a great time to include the team. Even if you're the one taking the lead on writing that down, I would pretty much never not include my technical leads on that. And especially if you are doing something that's very user driven, right? Like it's a great time to include your UX designers and UX researchers as well, who might actually have some really great insights into what metrics might move as well.
Cool. This one just made me laugh from Colin. What Northstars or metrics look good but often turn out to be absolutely terrible, much like NPS?
Time in an app. So I talked about that a bit. Like engagement is just really hard to measure. And when we think about like honoring user attention and how much all of us spend wasting time on our phones, right? Like what it's supposed to try to measure, actually, it's a proxy for user value, but it's not always very good because just because I'm wasting hours and hours and something doesn't mean I'm actually getting more value out of it at that like 4th hour playing a game on my phone, right? So that is one that immediately comes to mind. I think the other thing, they're just like things that are hard to measure, like productivity. Like what does productivity mean? Does it mean in the context of a browser? Does it mean you open fewer pages, more pages? It could go either way. So some things are just like contentious and really hard to define.
I would agree. I personally, the more tabs I have, the worse I feel. But some people love multiple tabs. I think it just depends on how your brain works at one point.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Another great question here is, how do you prioritize between leading metrics when creating a product roadmap? And how do you decide which leading metrics is the most important to your North Star?
And so just so that we're on the same page, so leading metric is also a technical term, which means like a leading indicator of a North Star metric. Is that what the question was about? Great. I'm
going to read again. So how do you prioritize between leading metrics when creating a product roadmap? Okay, I think the question is probably different. So how do we prioritize between which metric do we put at the top? Yeah, right? I would say that. So what would be the most important metric when you're prioritizing? And that's an easy one as well. It's the answer to that question is, how do you prioritize your goals, right? So the metrics correspond directly to the goals. Yeah, absolutely. Again, what I would say to that is, if you need any other help, literally what we do is show people how to prioritize your roadmap based on objectives. So we've got a lot of really smart people here. Do you ever test hypotheses using qualitative research methods rather than quantitative?
Yes, so that's where we're trying to understand the why. The qualitative methods can be much better there. So if what I'm trying to understand is why is something not working, or how might something, if we changed a certain experience, how might it make somebody feel, right? Like if we have questions that are like that, then qualitative methods are much better for answering them. Similarly, for like, if we have a hypothesis about user needs, like something much more global than what a feature could fix, it's another great opportunity to do UXR instead of running A/B tests.
Excellent. Does your Northstar metric roll up into overall department or company Northstar metrics, or is it all on its own?
It's a great question. For Chrome, it does, right? So we have kind of each team might have a metric that they're trying to drive, but theoretically it needs to be correlated to the overall team's metric. It gets more fuzzy when we get to the company level, because again, there's just not every single team's goals are going to be very directly correlated to the company's metrics. Chrome's a platform and an ecosystem, so it's a little different for us.
Yeah, I was going to say it depends. Over here, we have portfolio level, which would be the company, and then we have product level, depending on the product that you're managing. So fairly similar. I like this one, this next question. How do you convince others to focus on invalidating that hypothesis instead of trying to confirm your own bias?
It's a really fantastic question. I think, again, like trying to create this almost like mad science lab atmosphere of where what we're trying to do is figure out what the solution is. We're not trying to, the keys figure out, right? Like the process is the goal. I think that can be really helpful, but you're still like, people are going to be upset when you don't want to launch something they worked on for a quarter. And you can't really get around that, which is why you need to have like really strong storytelling skills around why that would ultimately be bad for the product and the user.
How would you recommend to look at there's too much data issue? Is there ever such a thing as too much data?
Again, billions of users, no. Like there is a practical thing here where like storing all of that information and processing it does cost you resources, physical resources, right? And so downsampling is the answer to that. Again, as long as it's done in a way that still preserves the kind of the sample in its unbiased state.
Excellent. I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to pick one or two, depending on how long this takes. Could you explain the concept of null hypothesis with an example, if you can?
Yeah, null is actually really simple. So null is what you have already built out, or in the case where your product is brand new, where there is no solution for the problem that you're trying to solve. And your treatment group in this case is whatever you're building to change that. In medicine, the concept is placebo, right? So like your null hypothesis is like nothing changes. It is the world as it is. And then whatever you do to it, we call it experiment treatment, that is the change that you've built out.
I'm going to pick one last question because I really like this, and it relates to timeframes. I'm super against timeframes and timelines, but do you ever make decisions that are not, let me read this again. Do you ever make a decision on directional results, i.e. not significant purely due to limited timeframes?
Yeah, we try not to. It happens very, very, very rarely, but not usually for something like a stable release. There is a way to correct for that, or at the very least to mitigate it with holdbacks. So for us, for example, we will often, for a change that we really want to understand, or maybe we want to track longitudinal impact of, we will have a holdback group that does not get that change for a period of several months or weeks, whatever is necessary. So if you're in a situation where you need to launch something because of a marketing deadline, again, none of us like them. They're generally bad, but sometimes we need them for one reason or another. That's one thing you can do.
Excellent. I think with that, we're ready to wrap this up. Thank you everyone for your questions. Really, really engaged audience. Again, we will be sending the recording for this out over the next couple of days. Thank you so much, Yana, for joining us and taking the time to answer all of our questions. Happy New Year to everybody. In 2021, January, we have Ibrahim from box.com joining us. So that's going to be a really, really exciting session. Again, thank you so much and happy holidays.